Over the course of history, humans have had over 3,000 gods. Yes, over 3,000.
We are getting daily reports of churches being burned to the ground, Christian homes being destroyed, as well as daily reports of attacks against Christian believers. But why is this happening?
I'm just so enraged by all these atheist displays and trying to push Jesus to the back seat.
I believe that God is about to sweep clean many, many places of power in America.
Hundreds of protesters gather outside a mosque in Afghanistan's capital to rally against the United States. Shouting "Death to America," they demand the U.S. government quash a church's plans to burn the Quran.
Welcome to the God Discussion Show. This presentation includes segments from select episodes of the God Discussion Show on Blog Talk Radio. Visit us at goddiscussion.com for daily news, opinion and articles, as well as information on upcoming shows.
Our special guest tonight is Janet Heimlich. She's an award-winning journalist. She's the author of the book Breaking Their Will, Shedding the Light on Religious Child Mistreatment. It's the first book to take an in-depth look at the religiously motivated child abuse and neglect in the United States. For 8 years, she was a freelance reporter for National Public Radio. We're all familiar with NPR. Her work won nine journalism awards, including the regional Katie, the Houston Press Club Radio Journalist of the Year Award, and the Texas Bar Association's Gavel Award. Ms. Heimlich has written many nonfiction articles for publications such as Texas Monthly, the Texas Observer, the Austin, American Statesman. She's received a BA in Communications from Stanford University in 1984. You can find her on the web at ReligiousChildMaltreatment.com, and we are honored to have her as part of our show this evening. I do want to get past the sexual abuse issues first. They're so commonly discussed nowadays, and I'd like to focus on the other issues, but it seems to me that this type of abuse goes on because of the authoritarian aspects of the churches, as well as their insistence that these things can be handled internally. And I was wondering, what your thoughts on that were.
Well, one of the most important things I felt I needed to do was not just expose problems, whether it be clergy sexual abuse or other forms of maltreatment that are infused with religion, but I wanted to answer the question, well, when is religion unhealthy for children? There have been studies that have shown that children raised with faith can do really well, and it's nurturing and helpful to them and helpful to families. So when do we get into a problem when religion is involved in a child's life? And as you just alluded to, the idea of authoritarianism is key to understanding how these problems start. And without going into the details of that right now, I'll just say that that's particularly true when it comes to sexual abuse. We now know, just from looking at any severe case of serial sexual abuse that's been permitted to go unbridled, such as in Penn State, and now we're learning about this host for decades was a famous host on BBC, where there was not just sexual abuse going on for a long time, but it was known. People knew full well about it, and because of their positions of authority, if they wanted to cover it up, it got covered up. And in the same way, if someone in a high position of authority was a perpetrator himself or herself, then it could go on for a very long time and no one will do anything about it. I think that whole scenario, how a strict hierarchy in an environment really shows itself clearly how it can lead to problems of sexual abuse when you look at a religious environment. The Catholic Church is just a telltale example. You have just, it's not just everyone understands who's in charge and who's not and that kind of thing. I mean, very strict laws and rules about who reports to whom and who has power over whom and that kind of thing. Of course, patriarchy is in any kind of religious environment where you have problems of religious child maltreatment, it's almost always a patriarchal environment where men have way more power than women. And so you can just really see how that comes to fore when you're looking at problems.
We've got a comment in the chat room who says there are so many people who believe that the accusers are making false claims. And of course, the church always denies the charges when first made. How many of these claims of abuse have been found to be false?
There have been a few. It's very, very rare. And usually if they are false claims, the lawyers weed them out. They usually don't even get anywhere. It's rare that it's so hard for a victim to be able to come forward and report it anyway, because the Catholics that are so devout and just don't want to hear this and can't let themselves hear it, they don't like to be not believed because they've gone through this horror and trauma. Mm-hmm. And so it's just a very, very rare thing. And I don't know the Catholic Church and the church officials, they would like for people to think that. That's why we've taken this to the International Criminal Court to investigate.
You may have mentioned something about preventative measures earlier. Correct me if I'm wrong, but is there anything you suggest to people who might suspect that there is a priest that has, let's say, those proclivities, any sort of warning signs that a member of the cloth is more inclined to take off cloth rather than keep it on? That's very hard to figure out because typically, child predators, they aren't ugly looking. They don't, they're typically, when they're priests, they are a very loved priest. They do a lot of good things. They appear holy and honorable. They have to, in order so they can continue to abuse and not get caught. In fact, they are usually the most charismatic. But to figure out if somebody, I don't know how to answer that. I'm really... You answered it well, I think. Perhaps it's better to keep an eye out for the ones that are the least likely, it would seem. Yes.
Or maybe rephrase that a different way. If you're a parent, how can you tell if your child is going through this?
For one thing, don't let your child alone with them. I just thought of an example. It has to do with this Kansas City thing that's going on. The principal of the school, over a year ago, before this Father Radigan got arrested, a year before, the principal wrote a letter to the bishop, a long letter, and the teachers there, even parents, because the priest was around all the time, butting in on class, and he was constantly taking pictures. But then there were little things. And this letter is public. It's probably posted on any Kansas City news about the Kansas City St. Joe Diocese. This information has been published in the news, even this principal's letter. And there were all kinds of warning signs. And they said, because now the Catholic Church, what they've done with this child protection thing is they have given their employees and all this training to help prevent child abuse.
Right.
Giving them all this training. Well, these teachers, they've all gone through this training, and it was working. It was actually working. She wrote it in a letter, and they had all these suspicions. I guess he was having these little girls sit on his lap all the time, and then he would say things that just weren't appropriate. And so the training was actually working, but she sent the letter to the bishop, and it got completely ignored. So that's why it's the hierarchy. There's always going to be child predators, and they need to be kept away from kids. There's no cure. They just need to be kept away from kids. But it's those who enable and empower and cover it up that make and allow more children to be abused.
Well,
that's
exactly.
Tragedy.
And as a parent, I mean, if your child starts acting withdrawn, or are there signs maybe that your kid, is being abused? To me, that's where I would look. And first of all, the one parent you mentioned, where it's a safe place where her daughter could talk. It seems like that's number one, that you really should listen to your kids. They're not making this up. But the second thing is, what if your child is afraid that he or she is going to go to hell for this? For saying anything, or is afraid that maybe mom and dad are going to be punished somehow. Do they act withdrawn, or are there some kind of things that you could tell as a parent that maybe there's an issue?
Since none of my kids were abused, and my brother, he is much younger than me, so I wasn't there at the time. I was already away and married. I can't really answer that really good. There's more information about that on the SNAP website.
Okay.
But the best thing you can do is the kids, by a child predator, they're manipulating kids really in weird ways. They will even say, a lot of victims have said, the priest said if you told, my parents would be kicked out of the church. And they don't want to do anything to hurt or disappoint their parents, because usually the parents are very loyal Catholics. Mm-hmm. And these predators know who to pick. They pick the most vulnerable kids, the ones that they think, okay, they can keep their mouths shut. And it's like us. We were an extremely, very Catholic family.
Is there any, have you been able to pinpoint the reason why it seems to just be the Catholic priests doing this and not any of the other denominations of Christianity?
There are other religions that do this, but the thing about the Catholic Church is it's a monarchy. The Pope is the head. Each bishop answers to the Pope. They don't have to answer to each other. They answer to the Pope. Each priest answers to the bishop. They don't have to answer to each other. They answer to the bishop. The parishioners answer to the priests. It's a perfect monarchy. And so that's why, and there's documents that we've turned over that we have discovered that come down from the Vatican to the bishops that say there's something called the Criminum Solicitus. It's where it was a very secretive document sent to the bishops that they should not, how they should handle this within the church so that it wouldn't get out, so that the public would. The church officials' biggest fear is the media, the public, the media, because then they have to answer. They do not realize, and they are beginning to learn, that the media is more powerful than the church.
That's exactly right. Well, look at Eddie Long. I mean, he's not Catholic, and that mess that went on, and we report on this stuff all the time. It just goes on everywhere, and I think it's sort of in some ways, the hold the church might have on the parishioners, too, their belief system and fear. Is it ever too late to get help?
No, never. Never. The day before you die, you might have a good day. Anybody who is a victim, if they're listening, you don't have to carry this around anymore. It's not yours to carry. It was not their fault. It was the person that did it to them.
How on earth do we deal with the issue of religious liberty? Because as you pointed out, this is something that's very deep and ingrained in American culture.
Yeah, it really is. And to a point where for a fringe part of the population, it really seems to take on paranoia, where people feel their religious liberty is in such jeopardy, they will do whatever it takes to defend it. It kind of reminds me of how people, some gun enthusiasts, the real extremist ones, feel about the right to bear arms. They're already talking now about they're going to go kill, you can see these YouTube videos, people say, if Obama, passes an executive order, I'm going to go shoot some people.
Yeah.
And it's not, and so you can just see how that can lead to harm. I'm always really perplexed when I hear people talking about raising children a certain way and say, I have that right to do that. It's part of my religious liberty. And I always, when I give talks, I often quote this one mayor who was in Lake City, Florida. In the late 1980s, there was a religious group that wanted to come in called End Time Ministry. This is a faith-healing, zealous group. There had been a baby that died of an untreated nosebleed in the group. And so some of the people in Lake City were really wary of these folks. And when the mayor, his name was T. Gerald Witt, when he wasn't seeing his residents welcoming the group with open arms, he told the St. Petersburg Times, it's maybe necessary for some babies to die to maintain our religious freedoms. It may be the price we have to pay. Everything has a price. Mm-hmm. And, I know that sounds extreme, and that was a while back, but, this is a public official who really felt very strongly about that to the point where it's worth babies dying. And, you see that kind of idea play out in all kinds of ways. For example, we have religious exemptions on the law books that allow parents whose children have died from religious medical neglect to avoid prosecution.
Exactly.
We have the Amish. The Supreme Court decided they don't have to put their kids through high school. You have these uneven playing fields going on where basically children who are being raised, say in the mainstream, have certain rights, but then children who are raised in some of these really pious, extremist environments.
To tell you the truth, I might have stayed Christian if I hadn't gone to seminary. It was by going to seminary that I learned enough about the Bible to realize, hey, a lot of this is nonsense. Deism is the philosophy that teaches just two things. One should base one's beliefs on reason and reason alone. And two, reason leads one to conclude that God exists, or at least probably exists.
But sometimes deists are thrown into the free thinkers category. Would you say that would be, which also atheists and agnostics are in that category, would you say it's because of the rejection of revealed text, maybe, that they are considered free thinkers?
I think it has more to do with basing beliefs on reason. I think deists, agnostics, and atheists are the three theological groups of people, and I say theological because their philosophies have something to do with either the acceptance or rejection of a belief in God. All three of those groups base their beliefs on reason, and in my opinion, everyone else doesn't. And that's why those three groups are closely related.
When you made that switch from being a pretty committed Christian to being a deist, was that a difficult switch for you in terms of dealing with your family and that kind of thing, or was it a pretty smooth transition?
It was very difficult. I have a friend. He was the best man at my wedding. He's now a monk on Mount Athos in Greece, and he wrote to me and he said that he fell to the ground weeping when he heard that I left the church. And ultimately, it contributed a lot to my divorce. But, I can't believe in the story of the Bible any more than I can believe in Greek mythology, and I didn't want to live a lie. Also, I actually got out of the ministry for the same reason I got into it. I got into I became a priest to make the world a better place, and then I came to the conclusion this is not the way to make the world a better place, and so I left for that reason. I thought that, and I still think, that promoting reason is what will help humanity and all the creatures humanity impacts.
You found out, what was it, last month or was it earlier this month, that you had lost custody of your kids because of your lack of religious belief?
Yeah, it was actually November 9th is when it was. Well, actually, that's when I received the order. The judge had actually signed the order into effect on November 1st.
But I have the order in front of me, and I'm reading this, and, you know, it's just got some standard things, a few things, you know, that she did that were questionable, some things that you did that were questionable, but there were two paragraphs in here that just, I don't even know why he put it in, the judge. Number 10, further evidence indicated that the petitioner father did not participate in the same religious training that the respondent mother exercises, and that the petitioner father was agnostic. Then he goes on to say, at the time of the property settlement, the father considered himself a Christian, and the parties were able to communicate relatively effectively. I mean, when you saw this, what did you think?
Well, really, I was just floored. The issue of religion had not really ever come up between my ex-wife and I in our time of discussion. I've been agnostic for almost 2.5 years out of the 3-4 years of our divorce, and there was never an issue. When I saw that, they did. I knew that they were raising the concern when we were in the courtroom, but I just didn't think it was going to be a problem because I had produced enough evidence that any of my beliefs didn't impede or get in the way of the children's religious training. Nor did I wasn't trying to force the kids into one mindset over hers or anything like that. So I was just completely dumbfounded.
And so did the judge that was hearing your case, did he raise this at all during your latest custody hearing, or was this just like totally out of the blue, something that her attorney submitted, or how did this even come up?
On the first day, our hearing lasted 3 different dates. We had over 20 hours of hearing, extremely long for a situation like this. In those times, they definitely, the judge really did not mention or say much during the hearings. Her attorney did attack me on the religious aspects. They had printed off my Facebook page where it had the religious, where you can put the religious views on there. And they printed that off and tried to submit that as evidence as to the fact that I was no longer Christian. When I took the stand, the first thing he attacked me on was when under oath, when we had to say, under the penalty, or so help me God, if I don't believe if there's a God, then who's to say I'm not on the stand line through this whole process and everything else? He was really trying to bring that point home. Yeah. And I had told him at the time, I said, look, to me, because he asked me what does it mean to swear under oath if I don't believe in God, and at the time I told him, I said, look, to me it's a verbal contract of putting my integrity on the line, and I have no reason to come forward and lie to further justify why I deserve to have my kids 50-50 still. And
unbelievable.
And the biggest thing is in the points that he brings up about my agnosticism, they are points directed at me. It has nothing to relate to my parenting with the children. It says nothing about how it interferes with the kids or anything like that. It just basically says he's an agnostic. And that was another thing where I felt like, really, how is my religious preference a factor in this situation? I couldn't believe it.
Right. Well, as I say in my book, the first sentence that I write is, a religious upbringing can be a wonderful experience for a child. So I feel the need to acknowledge that my book is not a diatribe against all faith, it's really important to understand when it starts to go downhill. When it leads to girls being murdered with honor killings because there are beliefs about what the Muslim faith says, or children are beaten sometimes to death because adults believe that the Bible says that they have to do it. We're not just talking about crazy people here that do this. Sometimes it is the mental illness plays a huge role. Sometimes people are just hugely sadistic. We have to admit that. But when you look at a lot of these cases, the individuals, say, who are charged with crimes and that kind of thing, oftentimes, they're not found to be mentally incompetent, and they're not remorseful, and there's something else that's going on, I think, that runs deep through our culture when it comes to faith. And yes, I mean, a lot of people have a really hard time, not just even considering that a religious upbringing can be harmful, but they're striving to defend religion at all costs. We can see fundamentalist Mormon sects that believe in polygamy and also having a lot of wives that are very, very young. That is part of their doctrine, and yet people will defend their right to marry their girls at age 11 or 12 or 13. This idea that, well, part of a religious culture, we have to leave it alone, we have to respect that. And that's what I'm kind of trying to turn the tables on, is just to get people not to hate religion, just to look at it as one risk factor. If you have a certain kind of religious environment and it's authoritarian, you really need to be watchful for the safety of the children.
You hear all the time that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the quiverful philosophy pushes an absolute domination on the part of the male. And there's a unique little twist to it, is that it is generally the women, the wives, who stumble across this quiverful philosophy, who start reading the materials, going to the conferences, looking at the websites, and they're the ones who get the idea. And they're the ones who bring it to it's the truth. And I'll tell you why it happens. It's because these women who are attracted to the ideal of having a strong male leader in their home is generally because their husbands are failing. Their husbands are already tending to be very domineering, demanding, and difficult to get along with. And so the woman is looking for answers. She's saying, what can I do to make this relationship more fulfilling, more satisfying? And she stumbles across this idea that there's even a book, Created to Be His Helpmeet, and it says, basically, if you submit to your husband, if you respond to your husband in a way that makes him feel manly, that makes him feel powerful and strong, and that he is the protector of you, that he is the provider, then he is going to step up to that. He is going to respond by fulfilling that role. And so the women say, hey, here's a way that I can finally get my husband to be, worth 2 cents. And so they start pushing it. I call, because a lot of times they'll talk about the verse in Ephesians 5 where it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and they say, this is why we do it. And what I call that is the peanut butter in the patriarchy trap, because it sounds so good. I'm going to get a husband who loves me like Christ loves the church. And the way that I do that is through my submission. But what you end up with really is a tyrant. It creates tyrants.
How did you get involved in Quiverful, Vicki?
I was introduced to the quiverful idea through homeschooling. I kind of stumbled into homeschooling, not really intentionally, but just because I had a precocious 4-year-old who already was reading, and I was like, how am I going to keep her interested for a year until she's old enough to start school? And my pastor's wife at the time suggested that I try homeschooling, which I said, you're nuts. I could not do that. It would drive me nuts. But I really felt like, well, for 1 year, let's just try it and see what happens. And in that year, I went to a homeschool convention and curriculum fair, and it was an amazing experience, because when you get into the homeschooling, you might go into it for academic purposes or for religious purposes. There's a lot of fear among the evangelical church these days, because there's this idea that there's a perception that the liberals are taking over the country, and that Christianity is on the verge of persecution. And then you got the whole Left Behind series thing coming in, and with all of that, there's just a lot of fear, and the reaction is to want to protect your children and shelter them. And so people in the Christian church are gravitating towards the homeschooling. And when you get into it, I went to this curriculum fair, and there were tables that were focused on academics. You could go to a booth and find some science materials or some math materials. And there really were not a lot of people browsing at those tables. Where everybody was at the Vision Forum table, or the Rod and Staff, and the vendors who are basically selling a lifestyle, who are saying, here's how to have a good, godly, happy home. Those, there were conferences, workshops throughout the whole 2-day thing, and you can go in and listen to somebody explain to you how to teach calculus to your high schooler at home. But there's only going to be a handful of parents who are in there listening. But there's going to be another conference in which a woman is explaining how you can use submission to build your relationship. Or they'll have workshops talking about courtship rather than dating. And those are jam-packed. That's where the interest is, because it's really something that is highly marketed among the homeschoolers. It's a business. It's definitely something that's a moneymaker for the people who are selling these family values. And what they do is they create a dissatisfaction and a fear, and then they sell you a product called Quiverful.
Hello, you're on the God Discussion Show with Vicki Garrison and Deborah. I wanted to absolutely jump in there and say a lot of this has to do with fear-mongering. They actually create a market for and a need for some kind of solution to fix all the ills and that in our society and life, and it's a ready-made solution. And people basically feel that they have no they don't have any responsibility. Somebody else is responsible for everything, and if you follow the foolproof plan,
they're selling a formula, because it's very appealing if you can have, if you can be told do step A, B, and C, and you're going to get D, then that is very appealing. That's very much like, okay, that simplifies things. That gives me this assurance that I can be, I can do a good job of raising my children for the Lord, and all I have to do is follow these biblical steps, because it's all promoted as being very biblical, and there are verses for everything that they are pushing in this philosophy.
And I believe biblical actually becomes a thought-stopping cliche. If you're a Christian, you don't want to challenge anything biblical. If it's biblical, you want to do it. And
absolutely.
You don't think, and you shut off your own critical thinking, and you assign your critical decision-making to somebody else. And you think, oh, well, I'm not responsible for what happens. And I just got an email from an author today who said, please don't publish this anywhere, but it talked about his family and how his mother sat down with him and explained to him many times when he was a child, we're going to do what God wants us to do by submitting, even though Daddy might choose something wrong. We're safe because we followed what God's law says, and we were obedient. We were radically obedient. And it's so there's this ploy that you feel like, well, somebody else is taking care of this for me. And I love Dostoevsky wrote in the Brothers Karamazov, there's this nice passage where essentially he's telling a story to his brother. One of the characters is telling a story to his brother, and he meets Jesus on the front of the steps of the church, and along comes the Grand Inquisitor, and he says to Jesus, we've perfected your work, we've given the people what they wanted, and we alleviated them of their responsibilities, and that's really what people want. They want an easy solution to problems because life is messy, and they don't want life to be messy. So.
Exactly.
That's so true. You mentioned the Bible. Within the Quiverful movement, are these predominantly fundamentalist Christians who believe that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God?
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. And so they go straight to the Old Testament, and they pick up on the patriarchal culture, which was predominant during the time of Abraham and that time period. And if it's in there, and if it's represented as, this is the way they did it, well, then we should be doing that today too.
It was a very different philosophy and culture at that time. And nowadays, we don't need a lot of kids to work on the farm or to...
Exactly, but we need a lot of kids if we're going to take over the country for Christ. Value as a mother is to turn out these arrows for the Lord. You're raising up God's mighty warriors, and the more the merrier. The quote that you were talking about as a lead-in to this program, where he says, we're just going to take over by sheer numbers. And what's interesting is, I totally bought into that idea that, if I have, a dozen kids, and my kids all have a dozen kids, and they have a dozen kids, and, I know so many secular unbeliever families who are, my neighbors, basically. Everyone's your enemy when you're in that mindset, okay? So everybody who isn't just like you basically qualifies as secular and unbeliever, whether they, attend church or faithful Christians or whatever, but if they're not as extreme as you are, then they're basically carnal, P-Warmer type Christians in your own mind. But they had 2 kids, at the most, maybe 3. And so, I really bought into that idea, well, we'll just outpopulate them. They say, well, if, the liberals aren't having their own kids, so they're out to recruit yours. And that's why you got to keep them secluded in your homeschool so that the secular humanists don't have a chance to get out their minds.
And teach them things about evolution and all this nasty stuff. And
exactly.
Somebody in the chat room had said earlier they're raising armies of God. And one of the things, on the page on God Discussion that introduced you as the guest, I had a video there where these people named the Shads, I don't remember their first names, were being interviewed about their particular view of Quiverful, and they embraced it. And one of the things they said was, we don't raise our children, we train them. And I thought that was very significant. And so in the training with the little girls, it was like they were going to be trained to be good mothers and submissive wives and, have all these children. And the boys were being trained to be the heads of the household and the breadwinners. So was that the kind of thing that
by the time my oldest daughter was 10, she could run the entire household on her own and do as good a job and maybe even better than I did, because she happened to have more energy because I was so run down with all of the pregnancies. But yes, that was that's basically the goal, that you're going to have these children, prolifically, as many as the Lord will send your way, and then you're going to train them up in the way they should go, which is the quiverful way. And yeah, it's what it boils down to, though, is in order to sustain a lifestyle, this large family, and they're doing everything the hard way. I mean, right down to grinding your own wheat to bake your own bread, because that's the most healthiest way.
Oh, yeah.
So time-consuming. It's so, like you're going back to the dark ages, and you're trying to live that life in this modern time, and what it does is it just exhausts the mother. It wears her out completely, and the only way that you can sustain that lifestyle is to heavily, heavily depend on your older daughters. The older daughters are the ones who are bearing the burden, the brunt of the quiverful lifestyle. It's on them.
You have 5 points that I thought that were really, really good about the psychological aspects of maltreatment, and this might be something that people might want to evaluate when they look at a church that they may want to join. And maybe you could elaborate on these, what they mean. But there is spurning, and you had brought this up before, but I want to concentrate on this a little bit. You have the spurning, terrorizing, isolating, the exploiting, corrupting aspect, and neglecting mental health or medical and educational needs. Can you address that just a little bit for the audience?
Sure. I feel like there's oftentimes a lot of discussion and thought that goes into like physical abuse, sexual abuse, and that kind of thing, and it's certainly warranted. But it should be acknowledged that emotional and psychological abuse and neglect is most likely the most common form of maltreatment. I do not doubt that just about every case of physical abuse, you're going to also have psychological maltreatment, the same with sexual abuse. So it really has to be recognized. It's not something that you can, prosecute for. It's really difficult to prove something like that. But when we define any form of psychological abuse, it's actually defined by the act itself. You don't necessarily have to prove that the child down the road, exhibited signs of mental illness or something to show that they were in fact emotionally abused. So, for example, if you have spurning, the way that might manifest itself in a religious context would be if an adult were to say to a child that they're not worthy of God's love, or they're sinful, that Jesus, doesn't love them, and that kind of thing. Terrorizing is, pretty much what it sounds like, where you're using fear-based religious messages to intimidate children, and both spurning and terrorizing, oftentimes can work together to really play a number on self-esteem. The third is isolating, and because that oftentimes works hand in hand with exploiting, I combine those together often when I discuss that. I think that exploiting is really one of the most common forms of emotional abuse when it comes to these religious issues. When a parent, for example, is trying to live their faith through a child, indoctrination, even with the best of intentions, that's exploiting. And basically you're not recognizing the child's psychological needs. For example, the need for children to be intellectually autonomous or grow into intellectual autonomy is really oppressed. And isolating, where you're denying a child exposure to just mainstream ideas, to other religious worldviews, allowing them to get close to non-believers and that kind of thing is a form of isolating.
Nancy Maney is also with us. There's a bunch of people here today. Nancy Maney is with us, and she's the author of My Billion-Year Contract, the memoir of a former Scientologist, which offers a bird's-eye view into the very secret aspects of the Scientology organization.
Before I became pregnant with my own son, there were many situations with children that were in Scientology. there are a litany of horror stories I could share with you, but I won't, because one will do. And basically, there was, in Los Angeles was the largest concentration of children. So Hubbard decided that the parents, first of all, the parents weren't allowed time to see their children. They got 1 hour at meal times to visit with their children. That's in a 24-hour day, basically 7 days a week. That's the amount of parent-child time that was allowed.
Wow.
So these children are growing up completely unsupervised and wild. Hubbard did some investigations into it, and he decided, or discovered, quote unquote, that the parents didn't care about their kids. He never brought up the fact that the parents never had time to see their kids. He just adjudicated that the parents weren't taking care of their own children. So he started this brand new organization called the Cadet Organization, and this was an organization for children and run by children, sort of like a little Lord of the Flies kind of thing. And these children, Scientology children, don't get an education. It's considered that if they study Scientology, that's all they'll need, because that's what's really important. So you have these children running wild in the streets of Los Angeles. They had horrific living situations for the children. The children did not sleep with their parents. I mean, the parents only had that 1 hour a day called family time.
Did they not realize the importance of education and nurturing and all that? You know, I've got kids and grandkids. I can't imagine only spending an hour a day with my children.
Children in Scientology are considered adults in little bodies. They're considered adults in little bodies. When this is skipping a little bit forward, but the second time I was sent to the Rehabilitation Project Force, the gulag that Sauté talked about, I had a 2.5, almost 3-year-old son. And my husband and I were both sent under guard to this other building across town where we weren't allowed to even talk to each other, let alone see our son. And we were told if we were really good, that after 2 weeks of being really good, we could see our son for 20 minutes 3 days out of the week. So basically 1 hour a week would be allowed.
Wow.
That's just unconscionable.
It is, absolutely. I can't even imagine that.
Believe me, my jaw was on the floor, and I was just like, how can I get out of here and go get my son? In trying to get me to stay, these other Scientology women who, I must say that it's a turn of the words, but they drank the Kool-Aid, shall we say. And they would tell me these stories about how my little boy was really this eternal spiritual being, and he was responsible for his own condition. So if something bad happened to him, it was his fault. This is at the age of 2.5.
Oh.
And I said, well, I don't think so. And she went on to explain to me with her child, when she was 3, she got under the kitchen cabinet and into some poison. Now, this was the child's fault, because she was a spiritual being and should have known better.
Oh, my goodness. And that just leaves a door open to all sorts of things.
I would to add, Scientology is an extremely dangerous cult because it makes the apology that death does not exist. Death is not dangerous because they call it, you drop the body, and you pick up another one, and then you come back, That is not important. You are not a body, you are a soul, therefore, death is not important.
I think you just hit on a fantastic point, Nefertiti, because I've been thinking about this as well, that whether you believe in an afterlife or not, some people do, some don't, but it seems that skews the opinion about war and some other things, because in a way it sort of minimizes life here and now. And I notice on religious sites a lot of times they're the ones that seem to be very supportive of wars. And I think that part of that is that they think, oh, well, these people that die are just going to heaven, or they're going to reincarnate or come back. You know what I mean?
Exactly. It is a total devaluation of human life. And once you convince people that death does not matter, then you can turn them into absolute slaves. Because you can say what you're doing right now is the greatest good for the greatest number, so your family doesn't matter. Your goals don't matter. Going to school doesn't matter. What matters is being here right now and working 10 to 16 hours a day so that you can help the cause, which frees people. Isn't that ironic? They turn them into slaves, telling them they're going to free people. And because human life is so devalued, it becomes so unimportant. What a fantastic way that is to completely trap people.
Now I'm going to be calling Claire live. Let's hope that this is going to work okay.
I will say, obviously, since escaping from Scientology, I've had my own children. And at every turn, it has been an extreme process of realizing the extremes of my own childhood, because obviously growing up in it, I had no perspective. It's not like I was born knowing, oh, these are the factors that make up a happy childhood. This is how you should raise a child, and this is how you should not raise a child. Obviously, I had no perspective. It was just, this was my life as I knew it. But you know, when my first son turned 4, it was a real slap in the face and a shocker to realize, wow, that was how old I was when my mother joined the SEER organization.
How do you feel about your children getting involved in any kind of religion at this point?
Well, for sure, you know, there's no way. I mean, I've told people many times, over my dead body, would they have any exposure to any cult? You know, I've given a lot of thought to that, and I want them to have their own views. But on the other hand, I'm not going to raise them in a religion. I myself, I'm not going to be ready to talk about religion for a very long time, if ever. You know, I'm willing to hear other people's views. I have total respect for what people believe in, but myself personally...
We're down to our last 2 minutes, so can you tell everybody your website again and some closing remarks, Janet?
Sure, I'd be happy to. There are 2 websites. One is ReligiousChildMaltreatment.com, and you can also get there by just typing in BreakingTheirWill.com, which is the title of my book. And then my nonprofit organization, the Child Friendly Faith Project, is childfriendlyfaith.org. And so you know, people can check out both of those and see sort of what feels right to them. And then I do have a Facebook group, as I mentioned, that's closed, and we have hundreds of folks in there, and it's been just a really learning experience for me and the other members to just hear from people and understand what they have learned about it. And it's just a great way to share information, whether, you know, that you're a religious leader or you're a survivor or what have you. And I am doing a lot of bridging with religious leaders because there is a lot of commonality there, where there are many people of faith and people who are leaders in faith communities who understand the differentiation between authoritarian faith and the kind that allows for society to grow and to breathe and that kind of thing.
We do have a special announcement this evening. 2 producers and directors of several well-known documentaries, including Pizza the Movie and a Meridian International Center film that featured both Presidents Bush, Henry Kissinger, Condoleezza Rice, Tom Ridge, Christine Lagarde, and several other political luminaries, are collaborating in the making of a feature-length documentary film about the Clergy Project and its members. Now, this film will be featuring Daniel Dennett Linda Lascola, Dan Barker, Dr. Darrell Ray, who's been on the show several times, also recovering from religion, Clergy Project members Teresa McBain and Mike Ouse, as well as myself, as I am a member of the Clergy Project, and I also sit on its board of directors. Now, one of my parts in this film will include me, as I am co-hosting the God Discussion Show. The film crew, yay! The film crew will be arriving here next Friday to film, and for this event, our show will not only be relevant to the topic of the documentary, but our guests will include Dr. Darrell Ray, who has had a very significant role in the development of the Clergy Project, and Mr. Jerry DeWitt of Recovering from Religion, also associated with the Clergy Project. Joining us on the show also will be James Brayshaw, a former Pentecostal leader who went through hell, quote, for proving that Satan is not real, and televangelist Bill Keller, a very controversial figure who's been very outspoken against homosexuality and Islam, as the founder of LivePrayer.com and was the force behind the Vote for Jesus campaign during the last election that received over 3 million pledges. You're not going to want to miss the show next week, and we will keep everyone updated, of course, as to when the documentary is to be released.
Visit us at goddiscussion.com for daily news, opinion and articles, as well as information on upcoming shows.